And here we are in 2018, restarting the Clayspots series. And today's Clayspots will be with one of the first gallery artists dating back to 2001, Bernadette Pratt, formerly of Kingston, Ontario, and currently living in London, Ontario. And we'll be talking about her career spanning 35 years. And Bernadette, welcome. Actually, you
Not
are.
quite 35 years.
Well, 83,
but
you moved to
89.
London.
89 to, sorry, I moved to Kingston in 98. So 20. I graduated in London in
89.
UK, yeah.
And
So
Camberwell.
Yes.
And Camberwell, that famous college that Lucy Rhee and Hans Coper went to.
Yes, Lucy Rhee, Hans Coper, Gillian Lowndes, who was a great inspiration because she's one of the few people who worked with Egyptian Faience. And she was an amazing, inspirational ceramic artist, a forerunner, and ahead of her times. And sadly, she left the college before I found my passion for Egyptian Faience. So there was very little
Connection?
well, teaching, actually, knowledge that was passed on, nothing at all. So it was all trial and error.
Now, the Egyptian faience, of course,
Which is
here,
this.
we have a piece right there.
Yes.
What I find fascinating about the Egyptian faience is that it's a recipe that dates back to Egyptian times.
Yes.
It was traditionally low-fired. It was what the Egyptians made their little beads and their little scarabs in turquoise that I think that everyone is familiar with. However, you took it to a different level.
Yes. So we all, in the second year, we all had to do projects where we used clay bodies, and I did use porcelain because I thought porcelain is amazing, beautiful white, and I saw myself as a functional potter. But a colleague of mine was working with Egyptian Faience, and the clay and the color response was something that really attracted me. So on the side, I played around with Egyptian Faience and moved up the temperature, and then of course it would run off. So you have the technical problems still are quite challenging.
But with the Egyptian faience, or Egyptian paste, as we've always called it in here, what was it that made you decide to start playing with the actual temperature? Because had the person that was famous for it, was she doing it in high fire?
She did not. No, she used it at the traditional temperature. But there was one other student who worked with it, and she put it into saggers and just had lumps. So it was like this explosion of color, but it was just it was melting out. And I wanted to try and see whether you can actually contain a shape, a form.
So control the form.
Yes.
I mean, as far as I know, and from my research, I've never found anyone else working successfully with Egyptian faience in actual forms the way that you have. Is there anyone else doing it, or is it something that you're unique?
As far as I know, I'm the only one who high fires. So when I say high fire, it goes up to cone 6 or 7. So that would be 1220, 1230 degrees, and it's traditionally around 900. So it's a huge increase in temperature. But it has been used only by a handful of people. Neil Forrest.
But he uses it as inlay and low-fi.
Yeah, so he does the traditional. He uses contemporary shapes, but he uses the traditional method of inlay technique.
So what you mentioned, the artist who was playing with it while you were at school and just basically melting it into amorphous forms in a sagger firing. Now, what you've done is you had to develop a means of controlling, or not so much controlling, but ensuring that the walls of what you were making didn't collapse. How did you do that? What was the process?
I buried it in sand. So they're all sagger fired. Sagger is a pot. stoneware pot, and so you fill the inside and the outside with sand, so that is your mold. Because anything else would fuse, so you couldn't use plaster because the plaster at that temperature would fuse. So the sand, the silica sand, is this mold, but of course it's moving, so you have little nipples all over the place and on the inside. And the reason why this is matte and this is glossy is because where it's matte, it's covered in the sand, and where it is glossy, the soluble salts in the clay body could migrate to the surface and build little crystals, which then makes that gloss, which then becomes a glaze. So it is a self-glazing clay body. So it's a very unique clay body, and it's a pretty unique way of working, and the colors come from minerals, and sometimes they also use obviously oxides, the minerals, but sometimes they also use manufactured colors from the clay companies.
So one of the remarkable things, unlike any other clay body, is that if, God forbid, we should drop that, you could take the pieces, reassemble them using the clay body. It's a different clay, using the same clay body as the adherent, bury it again in clay and refire. Is that correct?
It's not actually. The reassembling means it will look the same, which it obviously doesn't.
No, but I mean it'll be.
So what will happen is, like, this lip here was a previously fired piece that didn't work out or wasn't successful. These this piece up there, I don't know whether you can see that. The base of that piece is just put together from the shards of older pieces that either broke or I didn't like. So each connection of a piece needs to be refired. So that whole thing, going through the sagger, filled with sand, and then the top, the vessel piece on the top is then added with another firing. So there are multiple firings, and then if I think the piece might have some success, visual, or for me I'm pleased with it, then the final thing would be to sandblast it. And that is so that I can get rid of all of the sand that's still clinging onto the form, because nobody wants to have something that is shedding.
Yeah. Now,
sand.
Of course, the people looking at it, the reaction that they always have to it is it reminds them of something natural. It reminds them of coral. They're always commenting on it. It looks like it's been dug up from the sea. But the inspiration for your work, does nature play a heavy part in inspiration for what you do?
It goes back to being uprooted. So I was born in Germany. I lived in a number of countries in Europe, studied in England, moved to Canada, moved back to England. I've been here now for 20 years. So the sense of being uprooted was the inspiration, and still is the inspiration, because if you like to walk and you pick up a pebble, or if you're looking at the ground, at the rocks, they're similar. So it even though the colors are not at all anything what you might find in the rocks, but it's the surface, the sort of roughness that for me is that connection. And what happens sometimes, which is quite, again, it's exciting for me. People they go on holidays and they bring me sand wherever they go, and as I mentioned before, the inside has to be filled with silica sand, but then I use different sand it might be from Arden near Sherbet Lake, or it might come from La Réunion, an island in the Indian Ocean, and it depends I don't do any research what is exactly in it, but if I'm lucky, then I will get this wonderful strata, which you also see obviously in nature, and it's quite wonderful to have that connection to the outside world when you're working in the studio.
So that evolution of the work that's in the the Egyptian faience pieces, how does that migrate into your functional wear?
Well, as I mentioned before, I saw myself as a functional potter, and I was always kind of a bit in both worlds. So I always loved having functional work that looks appealing, that it's so when you're eating your salad or your soup or your morning coffee, I think for me it's important that I have a pleasing shape, something that gives me comfort and I can find the maker's hand, whether that is made by me or some other ceramic artist. I have a great collection of Canadian cups in my cupboard, so in the morning I open the cup and what do I feel like today?
Who am I going to have coffee with?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. I can relate to that. I do the very same thing. Now, what about the decoration? Because you mentioned form, but then moving into the decoration, the pomegranate has figured prominently in your work for quite a while now.
Yes.
And of course, there's pomegranate is associated with fecundity and all of that. Is that part of the inspiration, or was it just the fact that it's red?
I think it's food.
Yeah.
I think it's the food connection. It is the fact that when you open a pomegranate, it's exciting. I mean, it's like this surprise, this sort of the beads are just popping out, and there's that connection to Persia. There's a connection to ancient Catholic. You know, it was the sort of the fruit itself is crossing different faiths, which I find interesting. But it's food, and it's just the appeal of the fruit itself.
Well, it's interesting, as you mentioned, opening up the pomegranate and the seeds popping out. Yeah. And when you talked about using the different sands, you talked about the idea that not knowing what the sand in itself contains, and it popping out essentially in the way almost like the seeds of the pomegranate pop out. So part of the magic of knowing, but the idea that there's a spontaneity in both forms.
Well, with all of my work, I probably could make my life very much simpler if I would have a mold and I would just press it in and I would get that same image of the pomegranate and on the leaves every time. But I do like the hair shirt. I like the slow process. I like the fact that each of these pieces is always going to be different, even though they're hand carved. So it's that they're akin to a lino cut or a wood cut. So again, there's sort of you're bridging not just the ceramic, you're also going into the printing, even though it's not printed, but the appeal, the surface that I'm looking for is that printed surface, that lino cut surface where you have a positive and a negative.
Mm-hmm. Have you ever actually tried making a print from a carved piece?
I have, and I wasn't happy with it.
So but the process, the lino print process, and then taking it and actually, I think it's cool that you tried it.
Yeah, I did. Yeah, it's just not gritty enough.
Gritty enough.
It's too smooth. It's just too. Maybe it's predictable. Maybe predictable is the better word. But I like, even though it is, when you have a lineup of cups and you're working on, let's say you're doing 5 or 6 or 8 cups and you're sitting there and you're basically sitting hunched forward, and after 2 hours you haven't done a lot. It takes about 45 to an hour minutes to do the carving, depending on the hardness or softness of the clay. So when you're done and when you remember you should stretch, yes, it would be easier, but it's the hands-on. Whatever I do, I've realized it's that hands-on that I like. That's why I like ceramic. That's why I like cooking. That's why I like gardening. It's
that whole element of touch by
that
nature.
very kinetic. Yes.
So in choosing the medium, did you initially, when you went to art school, start with clay, or was that something that happened?
I always wanted to do ceramic, but when I did my foundation year before I went into my degree, at Camberwell, I was very, very intrigued with textiles. So it was a difficult decision. If I didn't have this connection with ceramic, I think I would have probably gone into textile, because it was the printing that I found interesting as well.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's interesting. I mean, at the gallery now, it's 17 years that we've been showing your work here and watching,
Yes.
the shapes, the forms, the connection, and watching people connect to your work. It's been quite exciting, and it's.
Well, thank you for hanging on to these and showing these, and they are such challenging pieces. I think you need a real connoisseur.
Well, I've found, because over the years, it's always interesting, not just what people buy, but why they buy it, and the people who react to the Faience react to the natural aspect of it. They love the connection that it has to nature, and the reality is that when people are looking at ceramic work and looking to connect to it, it isn't always because they've never seen it, their preconception of what to expect in clay, in pottery, they'll come in, and it's often people will come and say, oh, I don't really like pottery, but hold on, this is different. And not your work specifically different, but they start looking at what happens when you have artists doing work, because the reality is there is a progression. Like we show what we like by whom we like, but the reality is that those people have the ability to work with the material and have the inner spark that animates the work. And I think that's what people react to.
And of course, if you are using the shape of a vessel, the vessel has traditionally always been a serving instrument that holds nourishment.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, this does not hold anything but air and imagination.
Nourishment for the soul.
Yes, yes.
I think that was a good line to close on.
Yes.
Thank you so much for coming in today and being part of our new series of Clayspots.
Thanks.